Stepfather sold my car to help his friend. When they went bankrupt, I bought it back and left them penniless. My name's Jake. I'm 24. And yeah, I'm the guy who spent his youth drenched in oil and grime, working backbreaking 12-hour days. Why? To gain some sense of independence, some control over my life. And my old Ford, rugged, reliable, was the ultimate proof of that. It wasn't just a car. It was a testament to every drop of sweat, every missed night out, every aching muscle. It was my freedom, my claim to the world that, yeah, I built this. But then there was Thomas. Thomas, my 48-year-old stepdad, self-appointed ruler of the family, never one to let go of his iron-fisted grip on our lives. To him, family meant everyone else falling in line while he sat on his throne of control. Playing God over our finances was his way of reminding us who held the power, and that habit eventually drove us all to a breaking point. I'd just finished a grueling night shift, counting down the minutes to a hot shower and some peace. But as I pulled into the driveway, I froze. Something was off. My Ford, my anchor, my hard-earned victory, was nowhere to be seen. Just a few oil stains left on the asphalt, mocking me in the silence. First thought, someone had stolen it. Second thought, whoever it was clearly had no idea who they were dealing with. My heart hammered in my chest as I stormed into the house, bracing myself. And there he was, Thomas. Smug, self-assured, sipping his morning coffee as if nothing in the world was wrong. That grin of his, it was the grin of a man who just decided for everyone without so much as asking. "Where's my car?" I demanded, fighting the urge to snap the dining table in half. My voice shook, teetering between anger and disbelief. Without missing a beat, he looked up, almost amused by my reaction. "I sold it, Jake," he said, so casually that it almost broke me. Paul needed money for his new business. Paul, of course. Thomas's best buddy, the guy with more failed ventures than brain cells. This was a guy who could break records for bad ideas. But Thomas? Thomas thought friendship came before sense, and he never hesitated to back Paul's next wild scheme, no matter the cost to anyone else. "Are you serious?" My hands were trembling, a cold sweat prickling the back of my neck. "You sold my car?" "It's for the family, Jake. Sacrifices, you know," he replied, like I should be patting him on the back. Sacrifices. I knew all about sacrifices. I'd sacrificed my sleep, my body, my sanity to save up for that car. But to Thomas, family sacrifice seemed to mean sacrificing things that weren't his to begin with. I stared at him, half expecting him to follow up with something as absurd as, "The earth is a pizza, and the moon's a slice." His self-righteous gaze didn't waver. In that moment, I realized the line had been crossed. Thomas had taken from me without a second thought, and it was time he learned a lesson about sacrifices, a lesson he'd feel as deeply as I did. My mind was racing, piecing together every absurd, infuriating detail of this mess. Thomas was sitting pretty, dead sure that his so-called brilliant plan was about to launch as if Paul were some visionary genius, the next Steve Jobs, minus the skill, timing, and basic common sense, of course. All of Paul's genius ideas were as successful as paper airplanes launched in a hurricane. They didn't even look pretty as they crashed. And yet, Thomas thought he'd finally hitched his wagon to a star. It was all so delusional it was almost sad. But I wasn't about to sit around, watching this latest sandcastle empire crumble in slow motion. I had to act, and I had to act fast. That same day, without even changing out of my oil-stained jeans, I drove straight over to Paul's place. The whole way there I could feel my blood boiling, my fingers gripping the steering wheel hard enough that my knuckles went white. I didn't bother rehearsing what I'd say. I wanted my anger to be raw, unfiltered, the way they disrespected me. When I got to Paul's house, he opened the door and greeted me with that smug, self-satisfied smile that begged, absolutely begged, to be wiped off his face. That smile said, "Jake, you just don't understand my brilliance." But the truth was, I understood all too well, and it made me want to punch him even harder. He barely let me get a word in before he launched into his latest pitch. "Jake, you don't get it. We're talking millions here," he said, his eyes lighting up. as if he could already see himself basking in luxury, lounging in a mansion, surrounded by marble statues of himself. Millions? I narrowed my eyes at him, struggling to contain the disgust in my voice. You actually think this half-baked scheme is a gold mine and not just another ticket to disaster? You seriously sold my car for this? His smug grin wavered, and for a split second, his expression shifted. It was almost as if a flicker of doubt passed through his mind, a tiny crack in his armor. He tried to keep his confidence, but I could tell my words had hit their mark. This guy could practically make a career out of his failures, and yet he strutted around like he was some financial prodigy. He could have been the star of a documentary on spectacular failures, and I'd be the first one clapping at the end. Jake, trust me. It's an investment. Full return, new opportunities. He stammered, still trying to sound authoritative, but not quite convincing even himself. This'll be your last mistake, Paul, I said, my voice low and steady, carrying the weight of everything I felt. My insides were a mess of anger, but I kept my expression ice cold, like a freezer with the door left wide open. You sold my car for another one of your scams, and I'm not letting this slide. Paul's face went from cocky to pale, drained of its usual smugness. It was like I'd just pulled out something terrifying, a mirror reflecting all his empty promises back at him. His eyes darted to the side, and I could tell that, for once, he was actually feeling the weight of his actions. Still, he was too stubborn to back down and admit defeat. Even as fear flickered in his eyes, his mouth stayed stubbornly closed, too proud to admit he'd led everyone into yet another financial dead end. Leaving his house, I made a silent vow. I would get my car back, no matter what it took. This wouldn't end with some half-hearted apology, and I wasn't going to let him off easy. As I drove away, ideas started forming in my mind, each one more satisfying than the last. This story wasn't going to wrap up with a handshake or a shrug. No, I'd make sure it ended on my terms, and this time they'd learn that every sacrifice they demanded of me came with a cost. Weeks slipped by, and everything around me had that eerie, deceptive calm, the kind that lingers before the first crack of thunder. Thomas and Paul were fully immersed in their brilliant project, moving with the conviction of men who thought they'd unearthed a treasure, when in reality they were polishing up a rusty, lidless kettle and calling it the Holy Grail. I kept tabs on the news, and every headline brought a grim reminder of similar ventures crashing and burning. It was almost poetic, really. If there were a championship for destroying investors' dreams, Paul would have his name engraved on the trophy. Each night I felt the tension brewing deep inside, like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter, each day edging me closer to the breaking point. The house felt tense too, as if it sensed the reckoning looming ahead. One night, after a long shift, I walked into a scene that felt like destiny unfolding in slow motion. Thomas's voice floated out from the living room, and there was a tremor in it that I'd never heard before. A desperation he could barely mask. He was on the phone, and I caught my breath, listening from just behind the door. His words were almost a whisper, as though speaking them out loud made the truth too real to bear. Paul, we've got problems. Money's running out, and we're seeing no results. I can't pay back the debt from the car if we don't find new investors. His voice cracked, laced with panic, as if he'd just woken up from a dream only to find himself standing at the edge of a cliff. There it was, the golden phrase I'd been waiting for, hanging in the air like the final nail in their coffin. I stood there, struggling to keep my face neutral, but inside I was holding back a grin. Thomas, do you finally see the bottom of the pit you dug yourself into? How poetic that it took selling my car for you to realize you were in over your head. I silently backed away, leaving Thomas to stew in the mess he'd created. As I climbed the stairs, my mind was a whirl of ideas, strategies, each more satisfying than the last. This wasn't just a moment of triumph. It was the moment everything clicked, when I saw their world crumbling before my eyes. And now I was ready to make my move. They thought they were pulling the strings, playing the masterminds in some grand plan. But they didn't know I'd been watching, waiting, and calculating my every step. Their time was running out, and soon They'd see what it felt like to be on the other side of a sacrifice. This wasn't just about reclaiming my car anymore. It was about taking back everything they'd stolen. My pride, my hard work, my independence. I was ready to pull that last thread and watch it all come undone. My first real attempt to get my car back began with a trip to the police station. I walked in with my car papers in hand, feeling a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, today would be the day things started going my way. The officer at the desk, however, had the tired, bored look of someone who had long stopped caring about the struggles of strangers. Still, I pushed forward, sliding my documents across the counter and trying to inject a little urgency into my voice. "Sir, this is my car. It was sold without my permission," I said, hoping the hint of frustration and emotion in my tone would spark a response. The officer glanced at the papers, then back at me, completely unmoved. "Well, sir, this looks like a civil matter. You'll need to go to court," he said with all the enthusiasm of someone reciting the alphabet. I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around what he'd just said. "Are you serious?" I asked, exasperation creeping into my voice. "This man sold my car without my permission. Isn't that illegal?" The officer looked at me, blinking a few times as though he were struggling to remember what empathy felt like. "On paper, it's all legal," he repeated in that same deadpan tone. "You'll have to take it to court." And that was it. No discussion, no sympathy, just a swift brush-off that left me feeling like I'd hit a brick wall. I walked out of the station, numb, my mind reeling. Thomas had clearly worked fast, taking advantage of every loophole to make the sale look spotless on paper. I had to give him credit. He was good at playing the system, but that knowledge only made my frustration burn hotter. He thought he'd boxed me into a corner, that he'd won. But if he thought I'd walk away quietly, he was sorely mistaken. When I finally got home, I found Thomas in the living room, pacing as he chatted on the phone. He was grinning, that infuriating self-assured smile that made my blood boil. He looked like a kid on Christmas morning, rubbing his hands together and practically radiating excitement as he spoke. I slowed my steps, eavesdropping as he spoke in low, eager tones. "Just wait. You'll see. Big money," he was saying, his voice carrying that oily confidence that made me want to shake him. "Everything's going to plan." Oh, Thomas, I thought. You really believe that, don't you? If your plan is a symphony of death and disaster, then yes, you're on track for a grand finale. I leaned against the wall, watching him with a cold, calculating stare, feeling my anger slowly solidify into a hard, unshakable resolve. He saw this as just another victory, another notch on his belt, but he had no idea what was coming. As he hung up, our eyes met. He raised an eyebrow, looking me up and down with a smug grin. I kept my expression neutral, not giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside, though, I was plotting, every fiber of me focused on what would come next. He thought I'd roll over, that I'd accept his twisted version of justice without a fight. But he didn't know me nearly as well as he thought he did. This wasn't going to be some quiet surrender. No, I was just getting started. The wheels were turning in my head, and I knew exactly how I'd play this. He'd learned that every sacrifice he'd demanded from me came with consequences. I'd fought too hard, worked too long, and endured too much to let him take my hard-won freedom without a fight. The battle lines were drawn, and this wasn't ending with me walking away empty-handed. He could strut around for now, play the puppet master and revel in his supposed victory. But soon, he'd find out what it felt like to be on the receiving end. This was just the beginning, and I was prepared to fight to the very end. Paul's project crashed and burned so spectacularly it echoed through the whole town. Every promise of a bright future and a new standard of living was gone faster than the morning mist. Thomas, who'd strutted around like the great investor, now looked like he'd been run over by reality. Paul, true to form, vanished without a word. That guy was a master at disappearing the minute things went south. The knock on the door came at the worst possible time, just as I was trying to unwind after work. When I opened it, there stood Thomas. His eyes darted around, filled with fear and desperation, like hopelessness itself had possessed him. "Jake," he started, his voice creaking like an old door. "I know I was wrong. You have to understand, we did it for the family. I looked at him, barely holding back laughter. For the family, right, like my sacrifice made me some kind of martyr. For the family? I repeated with a sarcastic smile, looking him straight in the eyes. You wrecked everything we had. Don't even try, Thomas. He fell silent, realizing he'd dug himself into a deep hole. I felt like a victor before the game even started. My moment had come. I remembered a friend who used to scavenge for car parts with me. He could track down anything, anywhere, even if it was hidden in the farthest reaches of the internet. I sent him every detail about my car, and he shot back a single message. Found it. Auction tomorrow. The next morning met me with the noise of a crowd and the hammering of the auctioneer's gavel. I was ready to do whatever it took to get my car back. There was no room for doubt, just resolve and grit. The auction atmosphere was like the finale of a nerve-wracking showdown. People huddled, excitedly eyeing each car like they were choosing a life partner, not a rust bucket. But there it was, my car, my good old Ford. It looked like it had survived a couple of apocalypses, refusing to give up. The hood had a dent the size of a soccer ball, and one of the mirrors was taped on. But damn it was my car, and I wasn't letting anyone take it. The auctioneer, full of energy and hoarse-voiced, swung the gavel and called out the starting price. I raised my hand like I was holding an invisible flag. The fight was on. Bids were light at first. One guy even smirked, probably imagining himself driving into the sunset in my car. Oh, but not on my watch. Really? You're gonna bid against me for my Ford? I muttered under my breath, giving him a look sharp enough to cut steel. The stakes climbed higher. I put up every dollar I'd saved over the past few months of grueling work, like I was in a poker game with the devil. One by one, the other bidders dropped out, probably realizing they were up against a guy willing to bet even his right leg. When I was the last one standing, the hall filled with tense silence. The auctioneer paused, scanning the room to check if anyone else dared to jump in. Going once, going twice, sold! The gavel slammed, and my heart skipped a beat. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Then a wave of relief washed over me. My car was mine again. Dented, reeking, but all mine. I rolled up to the house, parking my car in its old spot with exaggerated slowness, like I was putting it on a stage. It looked rough, but it was back with me in fighting spirit, like it was screaming to everyone. Yeah, I'm back, losers! No sooner had I closed the door than Thomas came running outside, looking like he'd just watched his bank account shrivel up and die. His eyes were wide, his chin was trembling. Pure panic. How did you? I leaned back on the hood, giving him the most casual grin. I bought it back, Thomas. Now it's mine again. And that's my victory. A stunned silence. Thomas stood there, blinking like a fish out of water. He didn't yet know what hit him, but I was already savoring the moment. This was a punch to the gut, and I could see it knocked him off balance, completely. The next morning, he finally realized that his genius investment had sunk the family deep into debt. Just a couple of hours after breakfast, the panic set in. I was ready for the show. Sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, I watched Thomas run around, frantically calling Paul. But true to form, Paul, the master of vanishing, was gone, leaving his old buddy in a royal trap. With nothing left and the debts piling up, Thomas was finally forced to face reality. His grand plan collapsed like a house of cards, leaving him in ruins. I saw him in the house, surrounded by unfinished projects that had promised millions. Millions of what? Disappointments. All that was left of his sweet life were the shattered pieces of a failed empire. Thomas and his family left the house with a look like they'd just been dethroned. Each box, each flimsy dresser they hauled out felt symbolic. Once their status, now just time to go. I stood at the gate, watching as Thomas slouched under the weight of their stuff. This was the same man who used to puff out his chest and order me around like a king in his tiny kingdom. Now he had nothing left to command. I just stood there, relishing the moment, recalling each of his helpful pieces of advice and his eternal, "For the family, Jake." as if I'd been meant to be a sacrificial lamb for his great project. When they finally disappeared, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. This wasn't just about getting my car back. Sure, my car was mine again, but it was more than that. I'd proven to myself that I could stand up for my interests, and with every turn of the key in the ignition, I knew I was back in the driver's seat of my car and my life.